welcome to Science Lab. The science are happening because the Lord Jesus is coming. Every day we are looking at some of the signs that are happening around us.
Today we are going to look at some of the end-time signs happening in Europe. The echoes of the 1930s are being heard again. Events in Germany that led to Hitler's rise are happening again.
Germany has been shaken by an event with dramatic parallels with the 1930s. In the late 1920s, the Nazi Party was small. In 1928, it won only 2.6% of the vote, hardly a force to be reckoned with. But the following year, with local election in the German state of Thuringia, the Nazis won 11.3%.
It wasn't huge, but it was enough to make them kingmakers. Neither the mainstream right parties nor the mainstream left parties had enough votes to govern, so the state went into coalition with Nazis. Adolf Hitler's friend Wilhelm Frick became the state interior minister.
The dam had burst. Less than a year later, Germany's main right-wing party, the German National People's Party, DNVP, worked with the Nazis to form a government in the state of Braunschweig. And by the end of 1932, the coalition was repeated at the national level with Adolf Hitler as Chancellor. The rest is history. After the Nazis took over Germany and started a world war that killed 60 million people, far-right parties were kept firmly out of coalition negotiations for 75 years. That is, until February 5th, 2020. On October 2019, the same state, Thuringia, held elections. Once again, neither the mainstream right nor the mainstream left received enough votes to govern alone. After months of coalition negotiations, once again the mainstream right decided to compromise by asking the far right to help them form a government. No wonder many Germans fear they're walking down the same path as the 1930s. Thuringia is not the only parallel with the 1930s. The whole political dynamic in Germany and across Europe is the same. Here is the pattern. An economic crisis hits, causing people to lose faith in the established parties. The mainstream consensus proves itself incapable, so a few people start to support more extreme parties. This shift in support means mainstream parties can't win a majority of votes. The mainstream right, for example, must either form a coalition with an extreme party or reach out to its opponent on the mainstream left. Now the death spiral kicks in. A left-right coalition struggles. The two sides fundamentally disagree and cannot take bold action. They compromise with each other and form an unsatisfying centrist government. This causes more voters to reject the mainstream left and mainstream right and to vote for more extremist parties. When extreme parties are brought into the government, they are normalized, given legitimacy. Voters grow likelier to vote for them. Either way, when the mainstream parties struggle, the fringe parties thrive. This simply kicks the death spiral up a notch. It is now even harder to form a stable coalitions. Governing becomes even less effective. Problems get worse. Support for the extreme parties grows. This pattern played out in the 1930s and it is playing out in Germany today. In the 30s, the spiral drove more and more voters toward the Nazis. By mid-1932, the DNVP decided that they had to work with Hitler and offered him the post of Vice Chancellor. Hitler refused, convinced he was powerful enough to demand the top job. This refusal led to another election which the Nazis won. So German President Hindenburg invited Hitler to become Chancellor. Frick, who had risen to power in Thuringia, now became the Federal Interior Minister. Hindenburg and the mainstream right believed that they could tame Hitler. Instead, they empowered him. Once in position as Chancellor, Hitler grabbed absolute power. It was easy to see these parallels in Thuringia. In its 2019 October election, extreme parties gained most of the vote. Die Linke, the left, successor to East Germany's brutal Communist Party, won first with 31%. The alternative Für Deutschland won second with 23%. For any coalition to hold a majority in the state legislature, it must include one of these two parties. The alternate Für Deutschland started in protest of the 2008 financial crisis. All the mainstream parties had roughly the same economic policy. The AfD was founded by economists to put forward an alternate path. Then the migrant crisis hit Germany. Chancellor Angela Merkel welcomed 1 million migrants into Germany with little debate or discussion. Those who had concerns were branded as racist by the mainstream media. So the AfD began offering an alternate view on migration as well. This began a rightward shift that went far beyond merely concerns with migration. Jon Hock, the leader of the AfD in the state of Thuringia, for example, wants a complete rewrite of German history. He wants a 180-degree reversal on how Germany remembers World War II. To Hock, the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin is a monument of shame and should be removed. He has even brought up Lebensraum, living space, and talked about Germany's 1,000-year future, clear allusions to Adolf Hitler's expansionism and a vision of a 1,000-year Reich. Concerned about the direction of their party, the original founders of the AfD left or were kicked out. Not everyone in the party is as radical as Hock. Some view him as more of a hindrance than a help. His extreme rhetoric makes it harder for the party to pick up more moderate voters, they complain. Nevertheless, he is still tolerated and even promoted as one of the senior leaders in the party.
We have seen about the end-time signs happening in Europe, but there is more. So don't go anywhere, we will meet you after a short break. Welcome back to Science Lab. The signs are happening because Jesus is coming. We have seen about the end-time signs happening in Europe, and let's continue. With anti-Semitism surging worldwide, Jewish leaders are especially worried that politicians like Hock are winning so many votes once again. Some support the AfD due to legitimate concerns about migration.
But it's not just their polling figures that parallel the 1930s, the rhetoric does too. Fringe parties are rising all across Europe.
In Ireland's 2020 February 9th general elections, Sinn Féin, formerly the political wing of the IRA terrorist group, tied for the first place. Historically, Ireland's mainstream parties have refused to work with them. Now they are stuck with a choice: form an unwieldy coalition or work with a group that has killed more civilians than Al-Qaeda did on 9/11. Spain has held 4 inconclusive elections in the last 4 years. It currently has a coalition minority government, which is perhaps the most unstable arrangement possible. Meanwhile, a far-right party, Vox, has entered Spain's legislature for the first time in its democratic history. In the November elections, Vox won third with 15% of the seats. In 2010 and 2011, Belgium set a new world record for the longest period any developed country has been without a government: 589 days. Now the Belgians are going for a new record. Their last elections were on May 26, 2019, and they still don't have a coalition. Italian politics is dominated by parties that either did not exist before the 2008 financial crisis or were considered too extreme for government. In Sweden's most recent election, its main left-wing party experienced its worst result since 2011, and the far-right Sweden Democrats are now, by some polls, the nation's most popular party. Eastern Europe is full of governments that are right-wing, if not far-right, and most of these did well. In Hungary, Viktor Orbán Fidesz won 52% of the vote, one of the only parties in Europe to win a majority. In Poland, the right-wing Law and Justice Party garnered 45% of the vote. In country after country, European politics are entering the same death spiral that many of them suffered in the 1930s. During that fateful decade, the rise of the extreme parties didn't happen only in Germany. The rise of the extreme parties gummed up French politics. France had 5 governments between May 1932 and January 1934. In Austria, the death spiral empowered the Heimwehr, a far-right group similar to the Nazis but opposed to the unification with Germany. In Czechoslovakia, the Nazi Sudeten German party came from nowhere to win more votes than any other party. In Romania, the Iron Guard rose to become the third most powerful party, winning 15% of the vote in the 1937 elections after having been banned in the 1935 elections. Other extreme parties, like the National Christian Defense League in France, rose steadily after the 1929 stock market crash. France's far-right Croix-de-Feu League grew from 500 members in 1928 to 400,000 in 1935. After it was banned in 1936, its leaders started the French Social Party, which grew to become one of France's largest right-wing parties. Votes for extreme parties in many other countries also jumped. For all these people, a vote for the fringe wasn't just a vote for a different political party. It was a vote for a different system. They didn't want their current constitution or system of government. They were convinced their nation needed something different. Many of the people voting for the fringe groups today believe the same thing. Satisfaction with democracy is at an all-time low according to a Cambridge study published in January. The report states Europe's average level of satisfaction masks a large and growing divide within the continent between a zone of despair across France and southern Europe and a zone of complacency across Western Germany, Scandinavia, and the Netherlands. In country after country, voters believe the political system no longer works for them. So they want something different from the norm, someone else outside the established parties. The way Europe has worked for decades isn't working, they feel. They want something new. In the 1930s, the mainstream right parties dealt with the rise in extremism by compromising with the right and moving further to the right themselves. In 1931, Hugenberg's manifesto called for the end of the Treaty of Versailles, the establishment of conscription, the reconquest of Germany's colonies, a reduction in the number of Jews in public life, and stronger links with German communities outside of Germany. Politically, the difference between Hugenberg and Hitler was simply a matter of degree. In France, far-right leagues succeeded in organizing violent protests. The more prominent right-wing parties responded by shifting their direction. These were among those that would make up the Vichy regime that cooperated with Hitler after he conquered their nation. In Romania, the king attempted to create a royal dictatorship to prevent Nazi-like parties from taking power in his country. In Hungary, the regent was forced to accept a far-right anti-Semitic government. Some in Germany are trying to respond to Thuringia the same way. Germany's mainstream right party is divided on the subject, but a substantial faction wants to shift the party to the right. One leader of this faction and a top contender to be Germany's next chancellor is Friedrich Merz. Foreign policy explained Friedrich Merz would tack hard to the right, pushing the CDU to the AfD in an attempt to recapture voters that have fled to the populist right in the past elections. It even speculated that Merz would bring the AfD into a coalition, taking the same course the mainstream right took in the 1930s. Former Defense Minister Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg strongly endorsed Merz, telling the German press agency on January 17th, "For me, there is only one politician in the Christian Democratic Union left who I consider perfectly suitable for this task and who I would vote for, Friedrich Merz." Recent events in Thuringia did not follow completely in the footsteps of the 1930s, however. The state leader, elected with the help of AfD, lasted in the office only one day. The outcry across the country forced him to step down. Nor was he the only casualty. The fallout was so great it brought down Annegret Kramp Karrenbauer, Chancellor Merkel's hand-picked successor. Kramp Karrenbauer came under attack for not stopping the deal with the far right. Party members were already disappointed with her tenure as party leader, so she announced she would not stand as a candidate for Germany's chancellor. Revelation 17 warns of a political system that rises and falls 7 times. Verse 8 describes a beast, symbolic of a major world power that was and is not and yet is. This beast exists, then vanishes, only to then ascend out of a bottomless pit. Verses 1 to 2 tells us it is led by a woman.
Where in the world is there an empire led by a church that repeatedly rises and falls? This passage can only be referring to Holy Roman Empire in Europe, a series of empires that have all attempted to resurrect the Roman Empire and that have all been dominated by a Catholic Church.
This power has risen and fallen 6 times so far. Revelation chapter 17 says that when this power fully ascends, the people who belong to this world will be amazed at the reappearance of this beast. They believe this beast is dead, but then it comes back one more time. We are seeing that beast power rise in Europe one more time.
All these show us that what is mentioned in the Bible that are going to take place in the end times are taking place in our lifetime. We are living in the last days. Lord Jesus Christ is coming again very soon. Thank you for watching this episode. Don't forget to tune into Science Lab next time.
And before we end the show, we would like to ask you a question. What is the name of the political party of Adolf Hitler? And the options are option A, CDU, and option B, FD, and option C, Nazi Party.
Send us your correct answer to our email address sciencelab@angeltv.org. If you have missed any of the episodes, don't worry, you can watch it again on our Science Lab YouTube page. But don't forget to like, share, comment on the video.
And also ask your friends and relatives to watch Science Lab so that they will know that we are living in the last days. Remember, signs are happening because Jesus is coming. Maranatha.